My name is Yanis Bougathiotis. I'm a member of the editorial board of the New School Economic Review, currently a PhD student of the Economics Department. Before we formally proceed, I would just like to run with you today's program. As you see in your seats, you have these leaflets, hopefully, right? There's also a weird poster, just keep that in mind. So essentially you can see the program and the plan for today. We will start with a formal welcoming and short address by the editorial board of the New School Economic Review. It's going to be Mata Brahmasatra. Then we'll proceed with a short address from the chair of the Economics Department, Professor Sanjay Reddy. And then we have the pleasure, representing the student body, to have Nick Anderson for a short journey in the work and life of Anwar and Duncan through the lens of history of economic thought. And then I think the highlight of today's event will be the roundtable discussion that we will have. We will be introducing the moderator and the speakers afterwards. But for now, you can take a quick look. And lastly, we will have the chance to enjoy fine and premium wine selected by Silvina, so you can understand it's good, right? And have some social time that we can discuss and probably share some experiences and thoughts on the lives of Anwar and Duncan and Anwar. Thank you very much, and with that, I'm giving the podium to Mada. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Hi everyone, I'm going to introduce the issue and basically do the editorial board introduction. Before that, I'd just like to say thank you to Yanis for running this event. And I just want to start with, as a personal anecdote, I joined the PhD program in the last year of Professor Shaikh and Professor Foley's career here. I took Professor Sheikh's political economy course. I didn't take Professor Foley's because on the first page of the syllabus it said this is going to cause you to change your entire worldview. Learning is a tough process, and that seemed quite forbidding for me. First year I didn't really know much. I didn't have much to unlearn. Professor Sheikh's course was excellent, and even for someone with a deep interest in political economy, and I'd studied SOAS, this was the first time I'd really taken a course that I thought was truly original and not just exegetics, and a novel and, to me, totally convincing view of contemporary political economy. Furthermore, as an institution, studying and working in the department that they helped create has been an invaluable experience for me. I'm from India, where I would have liked to have done my PhD, but for the state-sanctioned repression of heterodox thought in the country, there are very few places in the English-speaking world that I would be allowed to do economics as I'd like to within a broadly Marxist tradition. I know that neither of them are too comfortable with the Marxian epithet, but labeling is left to posterity, so I'm allowed to say it, I think. Anyway, on to the issue itself. The New School Economic Review is a student-run, open-access, peer-reviewed journal operating out of the Economics Department of the New School for Social Research. We publish in a wide variety of fields. Though in keeping with the legacy of the New School, we encourage submissions in political economy and heterodox economics. We also have a call currently open for our next issue, focusing on structures, regimes, and varieties of contemporary capitalism. Do submit for the issue. The deadline is January 15th. This special issue of the NSSR, Volume 12, Issue 1, was composed to honor the life and work of two of the most foremost economists in the New School tradition, Anwar Shaikh and Duncan Foley. This collection pays tribute to their seminal work across varying subdisciplines of economics, including inter alia, Marxian economics, growth theory, and mathematical economics, as well as to celebrate their lasting influence on the field of political economy. This collection contains interviews, comment pieces, and peer-reviewed articles, all relating to various facets of Professor Foley and Sheikh's lives and work. The first interview is with Professor Sanjay Reddy, currently chair of the Economics Department at the New School. In it, he discusses the impact that Professor Foley and Shaikh have had on the department as well as on economics at large. Furthermore, he goes into the prospects for the continuation of their legacy at the New School, as well as lessons to be learned from their career paths and intellectual projects for current and future students of political economy. The next two interviews are with Professors Shaikh and Foley themselves, entreating them to reflect upon their scholarly careers and to expound upon the visions and principles that guided them through their intellectual lives. The comments and letters section begins with a piece by Professor Ben Fine. In it, he argues that mathematical economics, when carefully deployed, provides a means of undermining the mainstream on its own terms, and discusses how this approach has been embraced by heterodox and particularly Marxian economists, including Professors Foley and Shaikh. Next, in an online-only piece due to the length, Professor Riccardo Bellofiore chronicles his own scholarly development with reference to the work of Professor Shaikh and Foley and to the debates in which all three of them took part. It serves as a detailed and idiosyncratic history of Marxian economics from the 1970s onwards, touching on both well-known contributions and lesser-known works. In his comment piece, Michael Roberts, the well-known blogger, cantankerous blogger, asked the question as to why Professor Foley and Shaikh have each declined to identify themselves as Marxist economists, despite both drawing heavily on Marx's work. In doing so, Roberts highlights the wide range of theoretical contributions made by each of them over the course of their careers and the influences of other heterodox theories on both of their works. Finally, Rama Vasudevan reflects on what characterizes the new school tradition of political economy, identifying what she sees as core shared elements that make it distinctive. In particular, she emphasized the analysis of economies as self-regulating complex adaptive systems and the formulation of rigorous alternative macroeconomic models that adequately characterize such systems. The research article section starts with Thomas Michael's piece entitled "The Falling Rate of Profit as a Research Program." This paper addresses the relationship between Marx-biased technical change and the tendency of the rate of the profit to fall, presenting two different approaches to theorizing this relationship that draw on the work of Professors Foley and Shaikh. After providing empirical evidence for a fall in the rate of profit globally, Michael draws on his earlier work on fossil production functions, which portray an ongoing process of capital intensification and labor-saving technological innovation, to present a model of falling profitability in the context of Marx-biased technical change. Next, Pablo Luis Napoles' paper, "Exchange Rates, Unit Labor Costs, and Free Trade," provides a theoretical and empirical demonstration that in the Mexican-American trade case, Mexican free trade policies have failed to produce economic growth. The analysis is based on relative unit labor costs, in which absolute advantage regulates international trade. Patrick Mokria, in his paper, "The Quantile Impacts of Real Competition," presents a novel empirical exploration of persistent interwage industry differentials through the econophysics lens of Shaikh's real competition framework. The author combines individual-level wage data with industry-level characteristics to analyze the impact of the profitability and industry cost structures on wage growth at different points in the wage distribution. Next, Gregor Semeniuk's, I've written timely, but the growth paper, "The Growth Phantom," surveys the contributions of Professor Shaikh and Foley to the ongoing debates on the adequacy of national accounts for measuring economic activity. It argues that the SNA contains a growth phantom arising from how GDP is measured. Properly accounting for this growth phantom raises the possibility that environmentally sustainable growth is a statistical mirage. Finally, Jonathan Goliano's "Prediction and Description in Marxian Value Theory" explores the contributions to value theory made by both Professors Foley and Shaikh through the lens of Amartya Sen's characterization of Marx's theory of value as both descriptive as well as predictive. Goliano highlights how Foley's new interpretation and Shaikh's theory of real competition each address not only the quantitative dimensions of value and price, but also the human dimension of labor's role in the capitalist system and the crucial role of value-creating labor in the competitive processes that structure capitalism. Finally, we, the editorial team of the NSER, are proud that we've been able to commemorate the retirement of these two stalwarts of the economics department at the new school. We count amongst our editorial board members students of both Professor Shaikh and Foley, and we are grateful for our opportunities to work with and learn from these two scholars. We hope to continue to honor their legacy in our lives and our work. Before concluding, we would like to note that this would all not have been possible without the help of the help and support of the following people. We would first like to thank the editor-in-chief of this issue, Owen Davis, who's somewhere here. Today, Dr. Owen Davis, and Elena Blanc, Kurt Zem, Spencer Brown, Yanis Bouya-Tiotis, and Aida Farman. That's the editorial board. Thank you to them. I'm now going to list out several names, so don't clap for all of them. I would like to thank the advisory board of our journal, Stephen Kinzella, Ingrid Kwangraven, Benjamin Mitra Khan, Miriam Rem, Luis Daniel Torres Gonzalez, and particularly our faculty advisor, Mark Satterfield. Our current faculty has been an inspiration for continuing this legacy and undertaking this publication effort. We would like to thank them for their continued support. Furthermore, we'd just like to thank all the reviewers for this issue. I'm going to list them out again. Jacob Asa, Juan Jacobo, Gary Mogiovi, Juan Alberto Vasquez Munoz, Hyun Woong Park, Elis Schaffenegger, Remzi Terzioglu, Lefteris Sulfidis, Noe Wiener, Naoki Yoshihara. And finally, the event would not have been possible without the generous funding of the University Student Senate, for which we are grateful. As a journal, we would also like to particularly thank Silvina, our department secretary, for helping immensely to organize today's event. And thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mada, for this nice welcoming and presentation of the issue. We're very excited for that. Now I think it's time to ask Professor Reddy to join the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis, and thank you, Madhav. And thank you, Madhav, especially for referring to me as the current chair. I do appreciate that.
Whatever, chair.
I have, as Madhav mentioned, an interview in this issue, special issue, which will soon be in all of your hands, I expect, in which I talk a little bit about how Duncan and Anwar inspired me and influenced me, and how I would understand their contribution to the economics department at the new school, and my understanding of where they fit within the tradition, intellectual tradition of the new school, reaching from generations before them to generations, we hope, after them. And so I'm not going to go over that territory because you can read that interview if you wish. But let me just touch on some of the points. This is my 14th year at the new school. And that's quite something to contemplate, because I certainly haven't accomplished as much as I would have liked to have done intellectually and otherwise. But I learned a lot by sitting at the feet of the masters, so to speak. And I learned a lot from them intellectually, I learned a lot from them politically, I learned a lot from them institutionally, I learned a lot from them personally. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one who has that in the teachers, in the holistic sense of that term. And to say that one is inspired by that, I think is not wrong. And I think that that's the best that one can hope for from any teacher. One of the questions that was asked to me in the interview is that of what I think are the important contributions that students of the new school can today learn from the lives of Professor Shaikh and Foley. And I mentioned 3 ideas in my answer to that particular question, which I'd just like to point to here. Because I touched in this answer more on the personal aspect of what I've learned from being close to them and from observing them and from interacting with them. The first involves courage. It has been said that courage is the first intellectual virtue. Without courage, there are no ideas. And it seems quite clear to me, and I think it's often forgotten, that both Anwar and Duncan, in their different ways, bore a cost, even a great cost, for blazing the paths that they did. But this did not dissuade them. In fact, it would seem that it strengthened their resolve. Not only did they break with mainstream doctrines in which they had been schooled and give up quite a lot of the blandishments which they would surely have been able to realize by staying within the fold, but they continued to exhibit courage in doing, saying, and thinking what they believed in without regard to how others would respond. They were intellectuals first and foremost. And that's rare, actually, in the academic universe, surprisingly rare. The second important lesson I think students today in the new school can learn from them is that one should take theory seriously, even if, and maybe especially if, one is interested in action. This is something that in different ways I have seen Anwar and Duncan both underline many times, often quite explicitly and often implicitly. Without having the right theory, one cannot hope to have the right actions. And certainly if one has the wrong theory, one is almost sure to have the wrong actions, except perhaps by fluke. So it's terribly important to have the right theory and to accord to theory its own sovereign space, so to speak, without instrumentalizing every discussion about concepts and ideas. Both of them have avoided the vulgar pragmatism, which is all too frequently seen in these parts. I don't have to say more. But pragmatism can be a great philosophy, and it can be a very diminishing and limited philosophy. And I think Anwar and Duncan have always tried, as I understand it, to prioritize theoretical understanding as a way of disciplining their own thought and developing a framework which can indeed change the world. The third lesson which I think today's students can learn from them is the importance of being disciplined by evidence. They have both made the case that the standard theories do badly on their own terms by not actually explaining the world adequately. And that other theories, which are advanced, should do better in that respect. So they should be confronted with evidence. It's not enough to have a castle in the sky, however beautiful it may be. It must be confronted with evidence, and it must meet that test. And if it does so, then one is sure that one has something worth moving further upon. I think this is an extremely important lesson that one can derive from their respective intellectual lives and examples. And here, of course, I'm focusing on those things that I think I can identify that are in common for both Anwar and Duncan. I hope they will agree. But of course, there are also things that each of us have been inspired by and which we build upon in their individual examples. Now, some of you may know that occasionally in the past I have written doggerel, short, not very good poems, usually in the form of haikus, which I subject the members of the department to on occasions such as this. And some of you were lucky enough to have drunk some wine before the meeting started. Others were not. But in honor of Anwar and Duncan, I have written one haiku each about them and one haiku about the department and their contribution. First, about Anwar. As you know, a haiku has 5 syllables followed by 7 followed by 7. Unbending spirit serves the vast majority through the force of thought. And about Duncan, by his inner light, understanding capital with the latest tools. That's a reference in part to the Quaker concept of the inner light, as you know. And finally, for them both, and to them both, in our department, these 2 ghosts still shape young minds, and will long do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay, for the personal and collective reflection on Anwar and Duncan. It was very nice. All right, now I think it's time to give the stage and give a voice also to the student body, the students of this department and this university. We're lucky to have Nick Anderson, who is a MA Economics student here at the New School, and he will talk about the history of economic thought in a nice and insightful way. Nick.
It's hard to follow haiku. Hello, everyone. My goal today is to provide you with some historical context for our upcoming roundtable discussion. Specifically, what did the economics profession look like when Anwar Shaikh and Duncan Foley began their careers as economists? Duncan Foley earned his PhD in 1966 from Yale University, then began his career as a professor at MIT, where he remained until 1973, when he left for a position at Stanford University. Anwar Shaikh earned his PhD in 1973 from Columbia University and found his first faculty position at the New School for Social Research, where he remained for his entire career. The 1960s were a period of great turbulence, both in US history and in the history of economic thought. The Vietnam War and civil rights movements mobilized millions of Americans in opposition to American imperialism and institutional racism. These political movements of the 1960s radicalized many economists, who themselves were dissatisfied with the state of economics and its instruction. The clearest representation of this dissatisfaction was the founding of the Union for Radical Political Economics in the summer of 1968. Graduate students in Michigan, New York, Boston, and Berkeley formed IRPI chapters, began study groups on radical economics, and lobbied for their academic departments to hire professors who could teach alternatives to the dominant economic theory. These students felt that neoclassical economics that they were taught portrayed stale and depoliticized conception of the economy that they rejected. Let's dig into this. What was the state of economics in 1968? Mark Blaug argues that economics underwent a revolution in the late 1940s and 1950s, marking a shift towards a, quote, extreme formalism, end quote. This was kicked off by Paul Samuelson's 1947 Foundations of Economic Analysis. This book, which attempted to answer every economic question in the form of a constrained optimization problem. This book, which originated in Samuelson's 1941 Harvard PhD thesis, later became the best-selling economics book of all time. The centerpiece of this formalist revolution is Arrow and DeBrue's 1954 paper, quote, Existence of an Equilibrium for a Competitive Economy. This paper rigorously proved the existence of a general equilibrium in a market economy using mathematical axioms. In Blaug's words, quote, what was once an economic problem, is simultaneous multi-market equilibrium actually possible, has been transformed into a mathematical problem, which is solved not by the standards of the economics profession, but by those of the mathematics profession. Arrow and DeBrue 1954 was soon followed by Bob Solow's 1956 paper formalizing the neoclassical growth model, and in the early 1960s, by a number of papers by Arrow, DeBrue, Scarf, Samuelson, and others devoted to expanding on this research program. What is peculiar about these developments is that many economists of earlier generations who did not have the same mathematical education would hardly have been able to read or understand the development of this formal, highly mathematical theory. As we all well know, this was not the only existing paradigm of economic thought. In opposition to the dominant paradigm of Samuelson and Solow at MIT, arose Joan Robinson and Piero Sarafa at the University of Cambridge. The Cambridge capital controversies began with Joan Robinson's 1953 paper, quote, The Production Function in the Theory of Capital, and lasted well into the 1960s. This debate reached its zenith in 1960 with the publishing of Sarafa's Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. This book not only provided the English Keynesian with their strongest argument against the American Keynesians, but gave birth to a new tradition of economic thought, today referred to as neo-Ricardian. In the late 1960s, the capital controversy sputtered out with no definitive agreement on how Keynesian economics should develop. Now, let's return to the topic at hand. Where were Foley and Shaikh during the controversy? From 1966 to 1973, Duncan Foley was a young professor at MIT, where, remember, Paul Samuelson and Bob Solow were legendary and active faculty. Foley recalled in an interview that, curiously, he did not hear much about the controversies from the other faculty. He was busy developing MIT's curriculum for first-year graduate students and performing research on general equilibrium theory. Professor Foley did not dig into the controversies or break out of the neoclassical orthodoxy until his next appointment at Stanford. Anwar Shaikh, on the other hand, rose to prominence for his late contribution to the capital controversies. While still a graduate student, Shaikh became acquainted with Luigi Passanetti and, in the early 1970s, invited Joan Robinson to speak at Columbia. As Shaikh tells the story, Robinson asked him to look into the apparent empirical support for aggregate production functions. This led to his first journal publication, the infamous humbug production function. There is one more important thread that I have not yet mentioned that plays an important role in the careers of both honored professors, Marxian economics. Jean-Paul Sartre famously said that Marxism stopped between the years 1924 and 1968, alluding to two different phenomena. First, the rise of the Soviet Union and concomitant Red Scare in the Western nations drove Western Marxists away from revolutionary political practice and into the relative safety of academic institutions. Second, these departments were not economics departments. The most prominent Marxian thought, that of Althusser, Sartre, Della Volpe, and the Frankfurt School, was comprised of long tracts on philosophy, aesthetics, and cultural aspects of capitalist society. This is the central argument of Perry Anderson's Considerations on Western Marxism. Anderson's 1974 essay contended that the recent developments of Marxian theory had only begun to wrestle with the central questions tackled by theorists of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky's generation. Quote, what are the contemporary laws of motion of capitalism as a mode of production, and are there new forms of crisis specific to them? This is the task that Anwar Shaikh and Duncan Foley discovered early in their careers, then gave their lives to. What I find most inspiring in their work is its generality. Shaikh and Foley used every tool they thought useful and spent decades synthesizing contributions from various schools of economic thought. But that's enough for me. We are lucky enough to have both professors here with us today, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say at the roundtable discussion. Thank you for your time.
What a nice journey in the history of economic thought, the turbulent 70s and onwards. Thank you very, very much, Nick. And now, I think the time has come. We've talked a lot about them. Now we can hear them also. And I would like, Madam, can you change the slide, please? All right, thank you. To introduce probably the highlight of today's event, a roundtable discussion. The title that we have given to this discussion is the New School Political Economy Tradition. We're going to talk about what this mysterious beast is. Through the lives and work of Duncan Foley and Anwar Shaikh. We're very lucky to have Associate Professor of Economics here at the Department of Economics at NSSR, Professor Ying Chen, moderating today's discussion. And I mean, there were already a lot of introductions. I will be short. We have today here with us Professor Emeritus Duncan Foley and Professor Emeritus Anwar Shaikh. And then probably we'll have to try this because Isabella, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We'll probably see you in a couple of seconds also. But okay, since Isabella can hear us, I would like to welcome her online in this roundtable discussion. Isabella Weber is an associate professor of economics at UMass Amherst. And last but not least, we're very lucky and happy to have Jonathan Coliano here, assistant professor of economics at UMass Boston, who also contributed to this volume, and we're very thankful for that. I think we can welcome them to the stage, but before doing so, because I just figured out that we haven't shown the hard copy, right? We just talk about this, but never actually shown this. So these are the copies of the special issue. And as a gesture from the editorial board of the New School Economic Review, of course we'll give you more. But as a gesture of courtesy, I would like to give you, so you can also have them in the roundtable, 2 copies, one to Anwar, one to Duncan. All right, you can come to the stage.
And it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to this session. So while the panelists are taking the seats, I'm just going to say I also want to thank the editorial board of the New School Economics Review for organizing this event so that we all have this chance to come to this room to discuss and celebrate the works of Anwar and Duncan and to discuss the political economy tradition at the New School. So for the benefit of the audience, I'm gonna just quickly go over what's gonna happen in this panel. So I'm gonna, and we are gonna need to share the. It's on. It is on.
No. Oh, it is.
So also, thank you for giving me the opportunity to moderate this session. It's truly an honor to have this chance to sit with my exceptional colleagues. And
We can't hear.
It's on and off. It's on and off.
Yes, yes. One.
How about the other?
Yes.
This is
Yes, yes.
so
We're gonna share the microphone. Four of us will need to.
yeah, it's still on and off for some reason. Is it Wi-Fi?
Yes.
Okay, it's still on and off. Still on and off.
Okay, I'll just yell. Yeah. I'll just speak loudly as I do in class.
Oh, when I stand it actually works. Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, like I said, really honor for me to moderate the session, to have this discussion with my colleagues and mentors at the same time. So for the audience benefit, I'm going to ask questions in this round of the discussion, mainly based on three themes. First, I'm going to invite Duncan and Anwar to comment on their own intellectual trajectories and tell us about the journey that led them to political economy and to New School from their own personal perspectives. And next, I'm going to engage the younger generation of the political economists who are already notable scholars in their own fields to deliberate on how the works of Duncan and Anwar, as well as their own time of studies at the New School, have influenced and shaped their own scholarly endeavors. And lastly, I will prompt all panelists to envision the future of the New School political economy together. So I want to give another reminder to the audience here. We have this little post-it at the back of the pamphlet on your chair, and this is for you to write questions, and we'll be collecting questions towards the end of this panel, and so that we'll have some chance to read out those questions also so for the panelists to address. Okay, so I'm gonna try to sit to see if the microphone still works. Seems so. Okay, so I'm gonna start with Duncan. Could you comment on which do you think were some of the most important moments and encounters that shaped your intellectual trajectory?
Sure. There's only one mic. Yeah, the mic is part of the New School IT and audio tradition, which is just as lively as the political economy tradition, I'm afraid. They wouldn't, the guy at the door didn't want to let me into the building, which also struck me as part of the New School administrative tradition. Sanjay, before I'll get to your question, but Sanjay mentioned the blandishments of sticking with mainstream careers, by which I assume he means such mundane things as working computer systems, functioning administrative structures, stuff like that. But I'd just like to point out that there are compensations. It's not everybody on retirement who gets a haiku. So I think I didn't make such a bad bet in those respects. When Ying sent around these questions. The first question is about important intellectual moments in one's life. Those are hard questions to answer because there's tend to be a lot of possibilities that you want to talk about. I have written some about this in an essay, in a biographical essay that's published in a volume called Makers of Modern Economics, and also in some interviews with Barclay, with, remind me to take the pills I just took. An interview with Dave Collender and Barclay Rosser in a book that they published. So if you want to get more information about that, it's available. But I would say there were three things that popped into my mind when Ying sent the email around. The first was actually the very first day I sat down in Economics 1 at Swarthmore College in 1960. And the first, well, it wasn't maybe the first day, but 2 or 3 days, Bill Brown, my instructor, introduced us to the Keynes cross, equilibrium and a way of understanding the determination of national income. That just blew me away. I have never quite got over the idea that you could use systematic mathematical reasoning to answer questions about, important questions about human events. And I would say that was the beginning point in my thinking. This is rather strange. Well, a second important turning point was my course in mathematical economics with Herb Scarf at Yale. Nick Anderson mentioned Scarf's work. You might, I think, John, you've done some work on that too, right? Yeah, there you go over there. Scarf, I think maybe Scarf is worth a little more attention than he's gotten as a kind of dissident or a kind of a deviant in that group of mathematical economists. But anyway, this was an amazing course, and it definitely shaped my life. And I guess a third thing was the encounter that Nick Anderson mentioned of with Marx, but not just with Marx, but with classical political economy in the broader sense. Also Smith and Ricardo, which went over a long period of time because it started at Stanford with the group of very wonderful graduate students and co-faculty. Don Harris, Bridget O'Loughlin were some of the faculty members, a number of students as well. But then it continued after, due to sudden cooling off of the enthusiasm of the Stanford Economics Department for me and my work, which was connected with getting interested in Marx and classical political economy, and arriving at Barnard College and starting to teach regularly the Theoretical Foundations of Political Economy course there, which was in many ways the foundation of the book that I'm, well, it's that tradition. Okay, the book Adam's Fallacy that I wrote, and then I would say the final really important turning point was even more stretched out, and that had to do with my long-standing feeling that economics needed to be more of a statistically theoretically based discipline, which I really started to have those ideas at MIT in the 60s and tried to study statistical mechanics, but could never make the right connection to economic data and economic modeling. until I encountered the work of E.T. James on maximum entropy modeling, constrained maximum entropy modeling, which was the result of a colleague at Barnard, a junior colleague at Barnard, who pointed me in that direction. And I think that got reinforced by my encounters at the Santa Fe Institute with the physicists, who did ultimately persuade me that you couldn't have theory without empirics, and that the only way to have an honest theoretical discussion is constantly to go back and check it against empirical evidence. That was a point of view that I also found very reinforced in the New School department, among others by Anwar himself.
I think you have to hold it close to your mouth. That's what works. A signal. Thank you. It's always so wonderful to be in this audience and to see my colleagues. I've been retired, Duncan and I both, recently, and I don't miss many things about New York. I don't miss any administrators, but I really miss the faculty and the students. It's been really a great journey for me. We were asked to talk about important moments and encounters. It's always hard to, they don't appear as such, you know, they grow over time, but I grew up, my father was in the Foreign Service, so we traveled, and I grew up with different cultures. My mother was Christian, my father was Muslim, my best friend was Zoroastrian. So there was a range. I never thought about that. I mean, it seemed normal. And so when I first encountered at Columbia neoclassical economics, I was actually offended. It wasn't just I thought it was not real, I thought it was really offensive. Because not only was a misrepresentation of Western culture and all of that, it was a misrepresentation of the whole world. And that motivated me to study anthropology. I literally walked across the hall and took courses in anthropology at Columbia at Farewell Hall. And I think that gave me a sense that my reaction to it was not motivated by mathematical difficulties, though that showed up in my Humbug production function thing, but by some fundamental sense that this was just humbug. It was something that we were trapped in. And I never ever felt that neoclassical theory was even a bit close. But that, of course, leads you to what is. And that was a long journey. I want to talk about a little bit here. At Princeton, where I went for my undergraduate, I was an engineer. So one of the first things you know about engineering, especially aeronautical engineering, is not enough to have theory. You can't just build a rocket and light the fuse and hope that it'll get in the right place. You have to have a profound sense of how things work concretely, empirically. And if you don't do that, you can't be an engineer, you can't be certainly an aerospace engineer, because you have to balance the theory, which is quite difficult and complicated, with the repeated lessons learned from practice, from knowledge, and from error, by the way, very important. I went to Stuyvesant High School here in New York City, and I used to build rockets. I used to go to Prospect Park and shoot them off in the park, because nobody ever went there in those days. And we actually built them by taking cigar tubes, tubes, and putting a CO2 cartridge in there, which you have to very carefully read, fill it with gunpowder with a glass rod, because they don't want to thing, and then a spark, definitely a bad idea in that case, and shoot them off. So again, learning through doing and learning through error is a really important thing in my opinion. At Princeton, I actually heard Martin Luther King and I met Malcolm X. I mean, talk about influences. I was dragged to a talk by this man whom I heard was terrible, horrible, Islamic Studies Department, and to the great credit the head of the Islamic Studies Department, whose name was T. Kyler Young. I met Malcolm X. He was there. I was here. And he gave a talk, and afterwards I went up and I shook his hand. I told this story before, but I didn't know what to call him. Would he say Mr. X? I had no idea. I don't know what I called him. And he was very kind. And he asked me, you know, are you a Muslim? I said, yes. He said, you have to come see me in my mosque. And I said, okay. A year later, I came back and he was already dead. I went to Kuwait and then I came back. But that influence of people who went against the current, who risked their life, seemed to me perfectly sensible. And of course, there was the anti-war movement. We're having a little bit of that again, which is great. But the rising from students, from younger people against the ideology of the times, the feminist movement, which was growing in importance and strength, the civil rights movement. Then I came to Columbia in '68. There was a strike. I joined the strike, so that was another political event. It really is transformative to realize you can shut a university down. And I wasn't a major figure. There was younger people who did it. But I was a graduate student. Not many of us in the strike. I joined the building. I was in the buildings. And then at Columbia, the search for where do you go as an economist. And I had read the article by Harcourt in Capital Controversy. I had invited Joan Robinson to speak. To my astonishment, they said no to the department because she wasn't really an economist. That did not make me move away from that. It made me become stronger with Harcourt's article. And RB, which came out of our strike and the general sense that we needed something else, and there was a great gathering where RP was created and kept on going. RP is an organization which does not demand any particular point of view, so it was everything and different things. I encountered people in many political parties. I encountered communists and anarchists, and a friend who was both. These were very exciting times. They were incomparable in some way, and they were very stressful because you had to balance things and people. I want to tell Duncan's story about the computer. I came from Columbia with my cards. I don't know if you know. We have to feed these punch cards into the computer for them to read them so you can do your code. So I come from Columbia, and I go to the dean's office. I said, where do I put my cards? And he said, what is that? I said, computer cards. He said, we don't do computers. We think. We don't do computers. I bought a hand calculator to do my original work. One other thing is that this department is the only department I know that has a wine cellar. Cambridge, you have a wine cellar. Oxford, you have a wine cellar. At the New School Economics Department, thanks to the incomparable Sylvina, we have a wine cellar. Remember to advertise that to students coming in. Should I come to part B also?
No. It's on autopilot now. Should I, can I?
Just a couple of points there.
Go on.
Coming here was incomparable another way. This university is really unique. A European tradition, but also that everybody has to be confronted with different psychology, philosophy, and anthropology, political science. As professors, we had to sit on the dissertations and learn about different disciplines, talk to colleagues. I can tell you that economists don't get this exposure. This is one of the things I think that makes this department so different from many others and so good for students. And the last point is students. When I came here, there were coming 70 students in the first year. Think about that. The net cost here was $283. $283. Because school paid for financial aid, you could work outside, there was no visa problems there. And then, of course, the department. History of thought, Alberna's tremendous influence. I'm an economist because I read Alberna's book. Many people say that. The tradition here of people different departments challenging each other's point of view. Not always politely or friendly, but anyway, it's good for you. It's feisty. And the thing about this university is that people are really well educated. I mean, you encounter people who know all kinds of disciplines, all kinds of things, and trust me, in most universities it's not true. Certainly not in the economics departments. So that interdisciplinary exposure, certainly for me, had a big impact. It kept me on some kind of path. And lastly, the vision of political economy was European when I came here. And that includes England, which had a big influence on me. Sraffa, John Robinson, Passanetti, who was my teacher at Columbia. And Adolf Lowe, who was here, was my mentor, Robert Melbourne. Lowe told me, and I think this is what is true, told me that when he was young, his father took him to hear a debate. And there were two people debating, and Lowe was too young to see them, so his father put them on each other. And the two people were Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. I'm going to stop there, but these are the things that influence. You don't know things are influencing you as you proceed, but you learn over time what happened to you was shaping.
Before we proceed to the next question, I think we figured out the algorithm of the microphones. They should be switched off, and when we talk, we should switch them on. And then again, when we stop, switch them off. That's the algorithm.
So only one microphone on, right? Okay, good. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing your intellectual trajectory. I see some common themes. I hear the discussion about recognizing the sharp contrast between the reality and the neoclassical theory, especially in the context of a turbulent political movement time. And that kind of served as the main drive for you to explore alternative perspective and to comprehend the world. And I think this motivation probably will resonate with a lot of people in this room as well. Actually, Anwar touched upon a little bit about second question as well, but I'm going to now invite Duncan to also comment on it, which is in the many years of the graduate work as the graduate faculty in the NSSR, what do you think could be understood as a new school political economy tradition? What do you think is its main vision and its main pillars? And how's your work informed by that tradition? And how has your work contributed to its further development? And Anwar, if you want to add something, of course, after.
Yeah, I gave some thought to this. I think I have a somewhat different view of the New School tradition than some other people, so we might even get into a little debate about that. If you're interested in that, I strongly urge you to read Judith Friedlander's history of the New School and especially the early days of the New School, because there are a lot of unanswered questions there. For example, just what was the New Social Research? Okay, so the New School for Social Research. What did they mean by that? Now, I happen to think that even if you go back even to the 1920s, one component of that was that they were social scientists who wanted to incorporate quantitative evidence and quantitative reasoning into social science discussion more than many of their colleagues in the sociology and anthropology and even economics departments in Columbia and similar universities in the 1920s. And if you look at the whole sweep of the New School tradition, it's not uniformly left-wing. I mean, there's some very important people who connected to the New School. For example, Franco Modigliani, who is in many ways a giant of the neoclassical synthesis point of view, was a PhD from the New School. And I think he worked with Jacob Marshak. So the tradition is a little more complex than just a left-wing critical or Marxian or even Keynesian tradition. What I saw during the time that I was at the New School worked, and I would like to just get this on the record, and especially because there's so many new faces here, which is very welcome. It's also welcome to see a lot of familiar suspects, but you know, it's nice to see some new faces. Look, I think the reason that the department works is largely because of its curricular decisions. Okay, and you want to keep an eye on what is this curriculum? Well, this curriculum combines three elements in my view. First of all, it insists on educating people in the history of economics, in a historical approach to economics, in which the figures of the classical political economists and Marx play a central role. And I think that's something that you want to keep going, and keep going at a high level. And by high level, I mean it's very common that those issues are dealt with in a way that's inaccurate, that is not faithful to the ideas of Smith. I mean, Smith is even worse, more victimized than Marx, I think, in this respect. Because everybody wants Smith on their side. And when you actually study Smith, you see a much more subtle and much more ambiguous writer than you get out of many of the potted histories of economics that people have come up with. So that's one component. Second component is an insistence that, as part of the history of thought, that the students understand what neoclassical economics is, typically from a critical perspective, but from a rigorous analytical perspective. And I think that's a very important component of the curriculum to keep alive, and a difficult one to keep alive, because it's not easy to find someone to teach, especially microeconomics, which I did for several years at both the MA and PhD levels. It's not easy to find somebody who will teach that honestly, but also critically. And the third element is a quite aggressive level of technical, insistence on an aggressive level of technical competence. And I think those things went together to make, if it's not the tradition, at least it made the program. And it gives the program what sticks it together, in my view, more than a specific set of analytical questions or political economy questions, which change all the time. You know, so even over the 20 years that I taught at the New School, there was a big change from focus on economic stability to economic equality, from focus on the dynamics of the labor market to class relations, and to the new prominence that was given to issues of gender and ethnicity in political economy. So those things are going to change. But I think that you want to keep this core idea in some kind of balance as you go forward. The other part about the future, that's the third, that's part C.
Yeah, feel free to comment on it. We can talk about it.
Well, I was just going to say, there is a question somewhere lurking in here that about where the department might go, and what are some ideas that people might be thinking about. And I just would throw a couple out on the table. Look, I don't have any more insight into where things are going to go than anybody else, really. But you can you might want to think about two elements. One, I think the time is right to return to the study of alternatives to capitalism in a systematic way. In the 1960s and 1970s, the period Anwar was talking about, there was actually quite a vigorous economic analysis of things like worker-managed firms, worker control, the mathematics and theory of central plan socialism, the way that central planning interacted with markets, all of those things. I think maybe this isn't such a bad time to spend some thought reviewing that work and maybe trying to extend it and push it forward is one idea that I would have.
It's really interesting that you pointed out that the new school tradition is actually not linear. So it was always very critical, but it was probably not solidly established from the very beginning as we would understand it. And as I was reading your interview in the special issue, you even mentioned, you made the argument that you think the tradition probably was not, the political tradition that we're seeing now probably was not established until Helbrunner and the several faculty, including Anwar, that he later hired. So Anwar, would you like to also comment on that part, your understanding of the new school political economy tradition? Is there anything else you want to add to that before I turn to the other panelists?
Of course, I always want to add something. Yes? No. Okay, yeah. I wanted to say a couple of things that I rushed through and didn't say properly. The vision of political economy that I encountered here was composed of sort of three different things. A new school tradition, which is European. In this department included England, with German European, French European. And that was taken to be the defining element of the new school. Heimer, when I came here, we haven't mentioned Steve Heimer, brilliant economist, really brilliant. And if you have not read this article called Robinson Crusoe and the Secret of Primitive Accumulation, you have to read it. It just absolutely deconstructs all the Robinson Crusoe thing, which is important because in economics we're always talking about Robinson Crusoe without mentioning that he was actually a slave trader. And that's a little detail that should show up in the textbooks, I think. And I got to teach Marx because when Steve Heimer was killed, those courses that he taught, which was called Reading and Using Capital, and was about capital, not about Marx philosophy and history. It was about reading volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Capital. And I picked up that course. There was a lot of struggle. I ended up surviving that. And that course tremendously shaped my thinking because for 15 or 20 years, I actually had to read Capital, going through it. And what emerged from that was my project of trying to create a unified framework from the classical tradition. It came from the need to try to show that those ideas had construction all the way through, even though Marx, as usual, never finished anything, but he did lay out some elements, and they had empirical content that applied to the world today. And that's really, if you look at my work, it's an attempt to create an alternate framework, just grounded in that project. To have, and it was mentioned, Samuelson's foundations. But for me, this was the foundations I got from the new school. The task, and so I'm very critical of eclecticism. That is the idea that you can take one school of thought and mix another school into that. As an engineer, it's a pretty bad idea, but it just never made sense to me because they always had discrepant elements, and you should confront that. You should not seek to analyze the world in a way that will give you the right answer. Because the right answer cannot be what you want. It has to come from some foundation. And just to give you one small example of this, nobody was more favorable and supportive of the working class than Karl Marx. And yet, if you look at his arguments about what happens if workers' wages rise, what does he say? Well, they can rise for a while, but they'll affect the profit rate. They affect the profit rate, growth will slow down, and the unemployment rate will rise, and the reserve army will refill. Now, this is his analytical understanding and empirical, and it doesn't come from his desire to support the working class. It comes from the framework that he had developed, and I've always taken that general attitude. Last point, as Duncan mentioned, June Friedlander's book, History of the New School. I love Judy. She was a dean here, the best dean we've ever had. We only have two good deans, in my opinion, Nelson and Judy. But her history of the New School is not my history. It's a history of her people. I need to say this clearly. It's a history of her people, not my people, not my existence even. It stops exactly when David and I come into the scene, so to speak. And that's nothing to do with her. She's a great historian, but it has to do with the idea that the New School is about them, not about us. As you may know, a group of us about 5 or 6 years ago, or you will tell me like 3 or 4 years ago, formed a minority faculty tradition. I wrote something about that saying the following. The people who came to the New School were traumatized beyond belief by what happened to them. And they did what people in trauma do. They protected themselves by creating a community around them, which is a safe space that spoke their language, that had their ideas, their culture. But that was not my culture. I came here as a Pakistani Muslim. I tell you, it was definitely not my culture. And over time, that caused me lots of problems. I will talk about them in my interview. But for the group of us, what we noted was that this was not racist. It was protective. But over time, it became something else. It became a gated community, an exclusionary community. Even the philosophy department teaches European philosophy, but not British analytical philosophy. Why is that? Because they're drawing on that tradition. Now, that does not mean that the people are doing that, but when you talk about the history of school, keep in mind that that history is a history written by people who are talking about themselves. Judy's one of those. She's not talking about herself, but the history of the New School. Someday they're going to write a history about us. And I leave that up to you to do.
So much. So I'm going to now invite Isabella and Jonathan to join our discussion as well. So this is going to be the question for both of you. How does the New School political economy tradition, and particularly the work of Anwar and Duncan, shape your own work? And also, what do you think, in your vision, would define the New School political economy tradition? And I would like to start with Isabella, if that's okay.
Yeah, hi everybody. I wish I was in the room, and I wish you could see me without stretching your necks. But here I am. I wanted to actually pick up on Anwar's anecdote on Joan Robinson, which is an anecdote that I've heard many times, but listening to it now, it actually struck me that apparently the Columbia faculty said she was not a real economist, which is exactly the reaction that I got 2 years ago in very violent terms, where the University of Chicago posed an exam question asking what would a real economist say about what I had said, so thereby marking that I was apparently an unreal economist. And I think this kind of raises the question of what is an economist and what does it mean to be an economist? I mean, most textbooks start with this cookie cutter way of being an economist. Here's the way how to think about an economist. You have 10 principles, a little bit like the Bible of what it means to be an economist. And I think that both Anwar and Duncan, in their scholarship and in their teaching, have taught us to be a very different kind of of economist. And I want to reflect on that kind of question. So both of you have been role models for me in important ways. There was no way that I would ever be a brilliant general equilibrium theorist or a serious engineer turned system builder. Nevertheless, your intellectual curiosity and your seriousness, I think, has been some sort of a guiding star in my own work. I think for me, it in many ways starts with the history of economic thought, not as some sort of dusted archive where you ask, did Smith really write that letter, but as a conversation with giants, a conversation that we as your students had the pleasure of having been moderated by both Anwar and Duncan. Now, I think being in conversation with these giants gives you theoretical courage. It gives you the courage that you need to be able to go up against certain kinds of authorities in the discipline. But that courage doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from very serious reading. If you have a conversation with Smith, Ricardo, or Marx, or maybe also Samuelson, Straffa, Robinson, or Debreu, how can you be intimidated by a Prescott or Larry Summers? I think this is kind of some of the spirit that I took away from that kind of teaching. I would also argue that actually, and this might be a bit awkward for me to say, but I think one of the few people who had both Anwar and Duncan on my dissertation committee. And I actually must say, I'm sure I'm not the only one, but in my cohort, let's say, it wasn't a dominant pattern. And I must say that the disagreement between two brilliant minds that came from their genuine intellectual curiosity and their absolute seriousness and what they were doing was actually, at the end of the day, I think, incredibly productive, because it meant, yes, we will do something different, but we will not create our own orthodoxy, but we are in very serious conversations that go to the core of the matter. I also think that in terms of the ways in which you have engaged with tools, you have been incredibly helpful for my own work, and I think for many students, in the sense that tools for empirical research, from my observation, came in as a way to working out the empirics for real theoretical problems, rather than being the end in itself. In terms of the more specific inspirations, I would say that for Duncan, it's probably the long run method. When I hear the long run method, I actually kind of have Duncan's voice in my mind. And for Anwar, it's real competition. And I actually see Anwar in front of me saying real competition, with this very pointed way of saying competition. And when I started working on inflation in the context of the shocks that we have been observing, what my impression was that these shocks have, for a blips of time, changed the dynamic of competition and changed some of the laws that are in operation in the long run. And I think understanding what these long run laws are is what can enable you to see when they are not operating in any moment of time, which is not to say, therefore, the working of the whole economy has changed, but therefore the laws that in normal times would regulate the system are not operating in the ways in which they are operating in normal times, because you are not in a normal moment. That really, for me, has been the starting point in terms of thinking about inflation. And probably both of you fundamentally disagree with what I have been saying, but in any case, this is how I started from what I have learned from you. I think for Anwar and Duncan, it's also in both cases the attitude of saying, don't start from nonsensical assumptions. Don't build your way of understanding the economy by making nonsensical assumptions. And I think when Anwar was just saying that he felt that neoclassical economics was offensive and in fact humbug, this for me is like this first reaction that I as a first-term student also had, like, this is offensively stupid. Why am I being told to switch off my brain and make these assumptions? And I think the moment that you no longer switch off your brain and make these assumptions and say, okay, maybe in 10 years you're allowed to switch your brain back on and then we can start talking again, just that by that time you have become so used to these assumptions that your brain will never switch on in the ways in which it was before, is a way to stay connected with your intuition and stay connected with a serious way of thinking about the actual problems at hand. I also want to say that the New School has, in many ways, been, politely put, less than perfect, or as Lance, who unfortunately is no longer with us, once put in an email to me, this has been a typical New School fuck up, pointing to a long-run tendency of certain structural technical issues. But despite these less than perfect conditions in terms of infrastructure and so on, I think Duncan and Anwar have both shown us that it is possible to make it work. This is not to romanticize imperfect conditions, but this is to say that if you have a clear vision and a clear intellectual commitment, it is possible to follow through and to do your work in a serious kind of fashion and not get distracted by the less than perfect conditions. In fact, for me, Anwar is always, at the end of the day, also an engineer. And I had the pleasure of taking a train journey with Anwar a couple of months ago from Springfield to New York. And the little rubber thing on his mask broke. And he couldn't stop fixing it until it was actually fixed and it worked again. And that kind of, to me, summarizes some of the attitude and seriousness that Anwar is bringing to every problem that comes his way. At one point, when I was sitting in Duncan's office as an anxious student, having to file applications, and I'm sure Duncan could see how I was shaking from top to bottom and very unsure about my existence in the world, he said, "Don't worry, Isabella, this is just filling out forms," which is a kind of pragmatism that I think has really been incredibly helpful for me. And whenever I have to do these kind of tasks, I hear Duncan in my head saying, "Don't worry, Isabella, this is just filling out forms." So I think both of this is about being clear about what one wants, being clear about what one does, by being curious and brave and being ready to stand up for one's own way of doing an economist. In that sense, being ready to be the kind of economist one wants to be, and not the kind of economist that some authorities that might want you to become.
Beautiful. So beautiful, Lisa. Thank you so much, Isabella. Thank you for the thoughtful response. Jonathan?
Okay, good. So, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here for this. So, a question about the New School tradition. I'm somewhat hesitant to try to define the New School tradition. Kind of, picking up on something Isabella mentioned about not defining our own orthodoxy or anything like that. But I think that there are some really important aspects of how I learned political economy here at the New School that I, kind of keep going back to, and I think are important for, the road ahead in terms of where we're, particularly Marxian political economy is going. So the way we learn political economy at the New School through a careful exegesis of primary texts, I think really centers or foregrounds important issues in value theory. And I don't see these necessarily in other approaches, not at least as pronounced. Now, as tired as we might be of transformation problem debates, some maybe more than others, I think there's still a lot of really important takeaways or ways in which Duncan Anwar's work responds to these kind of lasting criticisms, unfortunately lasting criticisms that are coming from these transformation problem debates. The skepticism towards Marx's theory of value, skepticism towards concepts like labor values, or what can generally be called things like labor accounts, just anything kind of denoted in units of labor time or labor units in some way, even a category like surplus value. And I think, I find myself in my own work relying very heavily on Anwar and Duncan's work to continue kind of responding to these types of criticism, the skepticisms that exist, even in heterodox circles, unfortunately. So I think the New School tradition, or whatever could be called that, makes a really compelling case for Marx's theory of value, for notions of labor accounts. And I think that a couple really key, I think there's a lot of important space in this area for future work to continue showing the relevance of Marx's ideas. And a couple key, one thing that I keep focusing on in my work, or coming back to, that really brings me back to the New School here, is Duncan and Anwar's work, I think, makes a really compelling case for seeing Marx's theory of value as a theory of the allocation of social labor, for showing that creation of value occurs through the expenditure of human labor effort, and that other approaches to economic theory that perhaps overemphasize the properties of prices are not going to be able to make this kind of clear connection between value creation and the expenditure of human labor. I think this has been a really big key takeaway for me personally, and something that is very a focal point in my own work and kind of a anchor or safe space to return to as I think through new problems. In addition to that, there's lots of the methodological innovations that have come out of the department, influenced by the work that Duncan and Anwar have done, both in terms of computational methods, which I personally rely on quite heavily. Yeah.
So I think when we were talking about the tradition, we also inevitably touch upon our vision for the future. Duncan talked a little bit about this. Jonathan also touched upon that. So I want to actually invite the entire panel to address this last question from me, which is the future of the New School, the future of the New School Economics Department. What do you see as the future of the New School Political Economy, and what are some of the potential areas for further extension and deepening, and what are some of the potential ways through which we can further use the insights of the New School Political Economy tradition to address economic, social, and environmental challenges and to plan post-capitalist alternatives. So I think I'm going to start with Anwar, and then go to Isabella, and then go back to Duncan and Jonathan, if you still want to add something.
Meanwhile, I'm sorry, just a quick reminder, now is the good time for you to send the questions, if you have any, to the EB, to the editorial board, so that we can go to Q&A.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. I think these issues that we face today, the environmental issues, the depredation of the world, the enormous poverty, conflict, and violence, are not issues that can be confined to political economy or anything like that. What we can try to contribute in addition to joining that struggle, is whatever understanding that we can bring to some of the consequences of some acts that affect economics. That's all. I mean, I don't see, certainly not myself or as a leader in these things. Marx was, but then he got many things wrong, don't forget that part. That's going to be up for younger people. It's going to be up for you when people follow after you. All I can say is that please don't follow a theory because it gives you the right answer. It's a really dangerous path because then you decide a theory's content by whether the results are appreciated or proved by you. And why is this important? Because if you're wrong, you don't get punishment. At most, you won't get tenure. But a lot of people suffer from the consequences. And that is, for me, really important. I see so many policy proposals, deficit spending, exchange rate manipulation, price controls. Yeah, okay, those are good. But how are you going to analyze their consequences if you don't have some framework that links them? And I think that part of the left has always been that you get enthusiastic about something because you would like to see the result, but it doesn't follow that you will get that result just because you're enthusiastic about it. You have to be cold when you're doing this kind of politics and say, what would it actually do? And there's no simple answer to that, by the way. I have written something about Lula and the consequences of the application of what I like to call post-Keynesian policy to Lula and why it failed. And that's because from my point of view that there's a connection between those actions and profitability and what regulates the market. So going just one more point. My work has been motivated by the fact that capitalism is not controlled by capitalists, not by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, however repulsive they may be. It's controlled by the market. It's controlled by profit. And profit even controls those people who have benefited most from it. So that's why, for me, the theory is important. Because you have to understand how the market disciplines those who benefit the most from the market. So please keep that in mind. Don't deify the leaders of the Western world or the capitalists who control. Yes, they're powerful, but they don't control, actually, the system. The system, in the end, disciplines them. I'm sorry, one other thing. It was asked, why am I not a Marxist? So you'll get to do it next. When I was at Columbia, Joan Robinson used to take me along to meetings that she had because, as she pointed out, mostly they were really boring people who were celebrating her and didn't really know much about her work or anything like that. And I remember at one of these meetings, a very wealthy man at his fancy, elegant house introduced her. And he stood up in this little raised area and he said, "This is Professor Joan Robinson, the most famous woman economist in the world." Before he even got those words out, she jumped up and she pushed him aside. She was not shy and said, she stood up there and faced it. She said, "I'm not a woman economist. I'm an economist." Maynard does not make that distinction. That always stuck in my mind. She was an economist, and I'm not a Marxist economist. I'm an economist. Of course I learned a lot from Marx, but I learned a lot from Smith and Ricardo. My dissertation was on Kaletsky. I don't want to be stuck in that framework. It's not my framework, and other people's framework may be what theirs, but I don't want to be viewed as that. I want to be viewed as a political economist, that I certainly am, and I want to be viewed as someone who tried to construct a systematic framework. And let me be judged on the failure or success of that, not whether I'm a Marxist or a Muslim or even a New School economist, which could be another problem.
Ella, please.
Yes, I have been thinking about that question. I think it's a really tough question. I think, so for me, when I came to the New School, actually pretty much exactly 10 years ago, Duncan and Anwar were such towering figures that from sitting in Amherst, it's kind of hard to see for me what the New School is without them, which is no statement on anyone who's there now. It's just like from my vantage point of someone who was there from 2013 to 15, that is like kind of the image that I have on my mind, right? But I think the approach that Duncan pointed to, and I think Anwar in some sense also implicitly points to when he's saying, I'm an economist, I'm not a Marxist economist, and I'm not making a statement here on Duncan on the question of the Marxist part, I would never dare to do that, is that it's not about preserving something for its tribal nature or for its label, but I think it's preserving a tradition that takes the history of thought very seriously in the sense of studying theory in its evolution across history, and looking at the economic problems of today from the perspective of these theories that were before, and trying to understand how these theories can be made useful to understand what is going on now, rather than to say there's one theory that is now our label, and we will stick with this label, and this will be the solution from now to eternity, into eternity. I think that from my experience would be very much inconsistent with what I have experienced as New School economics. In fact, I dare say that having been at some other departments outside the New School, I think the central position of the history of thought as a form of worldly philosophy, not just this is what this person said back then, but what are the arguments that are at stake here? What is it that this really implies theoretically? For me, is at the core, but as a lived tradition, not as some sort of a cultivated orthodoxy. I'm not sure how popular this will be, but my sense is that looking forward, we will be confronted with a lot of problems that are coming from the overlapping emergencies that we are living through, that hit very suddenly and in pretty unexpected ways, and where I think it's extremely important for economists to speak out, and on one hand trying to make sense what is going on, and on the other hand also trying to think about how one could respond. I think this is not going to be as perfect as carefully built up buildings of thought that have been nourished over years and years and years. And there was a point in my career as a student where I was very nervous that Anwar might copy Marx in not finishing the book, but he did not, which I'm extremely, extremely happy about. But this means, I think, that we also have, we have to have technical competence, but I think we also have to have methodological creativity, if you want so, not in the sense of being non-rigorous or non-serious, but in the sense of trying to work with the material that is available, even if the data is limited, even if the data is qualitative, even if understanding the problem might require fieldwork, might require doing interviews. So I think that in terms of the technical approach, one of the strengths of the New School can be to not get locked in the kind of causal inference dead end, in my opinion, that the rest of economics has entered, which is a complete straitjacket that no longer allows you to ask any sensical questions that are important in the moment. So if you are equipped with a more versatile set of ways of thinking about the world, but also approaching empirical questions, both qualitative and quantitative, I think that could be really important. When I say qualitative, I think fieldwork is important. I also think that economic history actually is pretty important and can be a very useful complement to understand how ideas have operated in action in the past, which I think can be helpful in thinking about the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the thoughtful response, Isabella. I know Duncan has some remarks to make. We're short on time, so I'm going to abuse my power as the moderator a little bit. I'm going to read out the question from the audience, and then we're going to go around the panel for one final time. Feel free to either comment on the question or try to bring up the remarks that you wanted to bring, or to make any final remarks if you have anything that you didn't get a chance to say yet. So the question from the audience are, I'm very curious about your opinion on the future of capitalism. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Can humanity address climate change and world peace? Big question. Okay. I'm going to give it to you, Duncan.
There's a new school tradition. You know, you don't shy away from big questions. Anyway, I don't root either for or against capitalism, to tell you the truth, exactly. I mean, I'm more interested as Anwar, I think, gave a very good characterization of Marx's own attitude towards capitalism, which was partly to want to find an alternative to it and to do active political work towards revolution and change. But at the same time, not losing sight of the importance of understanding it as a historical and social phenomenon, which I think is true. I don't think that, I mean, what's going to happen with climate change is you're going to get a capitalist solution to climate change. Or something that's presented as a solution. But it's going to come out of the logic of capitalism. It's not going to come out of the logic of socialism or other things. The other two, well, okay, there's the Marxist economist thing. Mostly what Anwar said, Joan Robinson said, was just what I felt about that. That came up at Stanford, where everybody wanted to know whether I was a Marxist economist or not. And I had exactly that same view. No, I don't want to be characterized in that kind of way. And that was one of the reasons I probably couldn't stay at Stanford, because people would come to my office and say, well, if you want to stay at Stanford, the best thing for you to do is to be a Marxist economist. Which was I felt it was a kind of ghettoization that I didn't want to be part of. Just two more remarks on things to work on, or directions, or things to teach, or courses to have. It seems to me that in addition to rethinking alternatives to capitalism really seriously, trying to look at what they might be and what we know about them from a political economy point of view, I think it's a very timely moment to go back to the whole question of imperialism. Anwar talked about Steve Heimer's work, which was very much motivated by trying to understand the post-World War II international order. I think, for example, there's a lot of interesting things there. A couple of years ago, I was at a debate between David Harvey and Prabhat Patnaik, in which David Harvey said, we should retire the word imperialism from the political economy vocabulary altogether. Now, I think that's kind of I'm not sure that's the right way to go, but if somebody is serious, who's a serious student of Marx, as David Harvey, thinks that you need to do that, then maybe it's worth looking into doing it or not doing it, or why you might do it. And the last thing I was going to say was a little bit about the reproduction of the, not necessarily the tradition of the New School Department, but the reproduction of the New School Department. As far as I can see, the key thing about the New School Economics Department is self-selection. Okay? The reason it's an interesting group of people is because everybody who's here as a student and as a faculty member pretty much wants to be here. Now, sometimes I also have a theory of what I call the myth of the new school, which is that everybody who thinks about coming to the new school as an employee, a faculty member, or as a student, their mind gets a little a little scrambled around the idea that the new school has some magical property to it that's going to change their life and a whole bunch of stuff, which in many ways is not very realistic. But I think it is important for the energy of the place and the diversity of the place and the points that Anwar was making about the intellectual fertility of this department, that you keep it open to self-selection, that you make it possible for people to come who want to come, who want to be part of it, and keep that as the main idea of what's going on.
Okay, I think the question of the future of capitalism is a pretty big question. And obviously, I don't know the answer, but I have a question related to that, which I've said before, and you've heard it. In capitalism, what binds people, it binds a system, is the market and profit, because it dominates attempts to go beyond it, or against the grain for too long anyway. And one can have a long discussion of how that enterprises that are co-ops and all that, how they have succumbed to that pressure. It's a well-known history, and you should take a look at that. So, one question which I always raise, and I'll do it again, if you consider systems or societies in which people are not bound by force, but bound by some internal structure which may be not what we like. One of the most striking things to me has been the Amish, who not only have a very strong conservative male-dominated culture, but they also require every young person to leave for a year at least, and then they have to petition to come back. You can go leave and do all those things in the outside world that you ever dreamed of. In fact, you have to leave. But then you have to petition to come back. I don't know any model of socialism that has that built into it. Think about what that means. Think about that it's a conservative, religious, and there are other conservative religious organizations like that, Orthodox Jews here in New York City, were bind that same way. So we have to think about the binding mechanism. It's not enough to say we'll do good things. We have to be in a position to have people want to do those things. As far as the future of the New School Economics Department, I know there was an article recently about the future of heterodox economics. We haven't mentioned that. I won't say much about it except to say it's not the future, not my future, and certainly not the future I would propose. I hear the structure here has been dominated by two things. As Duncan said, self-selection. People want to be here. Not because we pay well, we certainly don't. Not because the computers work, they don't. Because it's a polity. It's a set of people who are willing to listen and argue and ask questions. The first thing I noticed about the new school when I came here as a faculty, damn, those people really fight and argue. And this is a tough place to be. I know stories of faculty who were driven from the classroom in tears, literally, by the reaction of students. I don't recommend that, by the way, but it was true of that time. And in the process, you learn a lot. So it isn't the faculty, it's the polity. And students are very important in it, because if you don't fight for what you think is important, it'll slide you right over into a place which I think would be a bad place. And the other thing is, why do we require you to read the history of thought? And the answer is very simple, because they were smarter than we are. And if you don't understand that, then I think you're missing part of the tradition here. They just were. It's like, why do you study Mozart? Well, because at 3, he was already better than you will be. So, pay attention. And apropos of that, one of the strengths of this place is the consistency of alternate cores. As I said, I'm not in favor of eclecticism. I think it's an easy way out because it doesn't confront the difficulties then. But we have a Marxian core or classical political economy core that Duncan and I have long worked on. We have post-Keynesian economics, and we have several faculty historically, including now Mark is the head, Mark Setterfield is the head of that tradition. We have other traditions here that address issues of feminism, which are very important. We don't do much about racism here, but we could and we should, but tied to these other things. And that's not going to come from us. We are, in effect, ghosts brought back to speak for a while, but it's going to come from you. And I know that that's an easy thing to say. All I can say is that if you're doing it, keep in mind the two sides of it, that you want to change, you want to develop new ideas, but in my opinion, you should try to link them to others. And some people find that oppressive. You know, why should I have to talk about other ideas? This is my point of view. This is what the New School brings you to, this department, is to confront how your ideas mix and match and conflict with others. And that conflict is a really, really important thing to pay attention to, in my opinion. That's what we do here well, and I think we should keep going in that tradition. Confront, but don't hate. Conflict, but not violence.
Jonathan, would you like to comment on any of the questions?
Okay, I'll be brief. On the question about the kind of future of capitalism, I'm ill-equipped to try to give a good answer about that. But I think in terms of how the political economy of the New School can address some of these questions about the future of capitalism, things like climate change, you know, the work done here really helps to see the exploitative and distributional aspects of these kinds of problems that are easy to miss otherwise. And I think that that's really important for us to keep in mind.
Isabella, would you like to comment on any of the questions?
Yeah, maybe just a quick comment on the capitalism question. So I don't see myself qualified to predict the future of capitalism, but as someone who has actually studied quite a bit the debates in the socialist world, one thing that I have observed many times on the part of Marxist scholars trying to think about alternatives is that there is some sort of a break, like a logical break. There's an analysis of capitalism, and then there's a logical break, and then you paint the pie in the sky alternative. And what is in between the pie in the sky and the very detailed analysis of the here and now is often much fussier, which maybe by its nature is much fussier. But I think in trying to think about transforming capitalism towards something else, it's really important to think about how the dynamics that I think we can understand pretty well can be used to create something different, how they can be channeled, how they can be leveraged, how they can be guided, which I know is not easy because, as Anwar was just pointing out, they are incredibly forceful dynamics. But instead of thinking you can go against them in some local pocket, think about the question, how can these dynamics themselves be utilized to go in a different direction? And maybe to be specific in regard to climate change, from my perspective, one often overlooked dimension to the question of how to address climate change is to take profitability seriously. I mean, if you talk about CO2 prices, you talk about prices, and there's such a huge literature about prices. But my impression is that there's much less attention being paid to the question of profitability. And if oil and gas continue to be as profitable in times of shocks as they have been in recent years, I think it will be very hard to channel out of these dirty things. Yeah, I guess that's my 5 cents.
So as we are bringing this conversation to an end, I want to just thank all the panelists again, and also the audience as well. We're already actually half an hour beyond the original schedule time.
Yeah.
Really, if you still are not, don't feel enough about hearing what Anwar and Duncan have to say, please read the special issue. There is a very detailed version of their interview in it.
I think we have to give a warm applause for everyone.